Bienvenidos al Cerebro Matemático. El Cerebro Matemático hace parte de la iniciativa Cerebro y Aprendizajes, un coloquio anual organizado por el Colegio Hacienda Los Alcaparros, que desde el 2017 se celebra anualmente. En contados instantes, daremos inicio a la tercera charla del Cerebro Matemático, que marca la cuarta versión del coloquio Cerebro y Aprendizajes.
En nombre del Colegio Hacienda Los Alcaparros, quiero darles la más cordial bienvenida a este tercer momento de la serie de 4 momentos del cerebro matemático. Obviamente nos encontramos en un momento muy especial, celebrando el Día de la Mujer y esta lucha y esta búsqueda por la equidad que ha tenido la mujer durante todos estos años, y nada menos que para presentar en el tema de matemáticas a una gran investigadora de nuestros tiempos, una mujer joven, una mujer dinámica que está cambiando el pensamiento en términos de la neuropsicología y en términos de la neurociencia, para enseñarnos a quienes enseñamos a tener en cuenta el cerebro en nuestros procesos de enseñanza y aprendizaje que hacemos en los colegios. La doctora Marie Amalric será muy importante y un recuerdo enorme de la celebración de este Día de la Mujer. Para el Colegio Hacienda Los Alcaparros es realmente un honor y un orgullo haber podido llevar adelante lo que llamamos la iniciativa del cerebro, e ir ofreciendo cada año a nuestros padres de familia, a los otros colegios, a la comunidad de educadores, temas tan importantes como la música, la ciencia, la matemática, el bilingüismo, para aportar a la calidad de la educación en Colombia. Nunca antes se sintió tal necesidad de abrir un nuevo camino de pensamiento, con nuevos parámetros, con nuevos ideales, con nuevas esperanzas y fortunas que en este momento en que hemos vivido esta situación, la humanidad. Consideramos el día de hoy un día que marca en nuestras vidas de educadores un nuevo empiece para mirar las matemáticas en los colegios, no como la asignatura que asusta a los niños o la asignatura que pone en duda su propia autoestima, sino como la asignatura que realmente va a abrir para ellos un camino de futuro, un camino de pensamiento y una manera de ser en el mundo que les traerá enormes ventajas. Esta serie del cerebro de inspira, enseña y entiende en el día de hoy es muy importante cómo nos van a mostrar tanto la doctora Marí como el doctor Julio Fonnegra nos van a mostrar cómo cerebro y aprendizaje son casi una misma cosa. Cuando enseñamos, modelamos el cerebro. El cerebro nos presenta el potencial que hace posible que los aprendizajes se den. Con estas cortas palabras, le doy la bienvenida a los amigos rectores, a los padres de familia del Colegio Hacienda Los Alcaparros, a las personas que están interesadas en esta semana de las matemáticas y que nos acompañarán un poquito más adelante. Voy a presentar a la doctora Marí Amalric, quien muy amablemente ha aceptado nuestra invitación. Marí es becaria en el programa de postdoctorado de la Universidad de Harvard, en uno de los más importantes laboratorios del mundo acerca de los estudios del desarrollo. Ella ha hecho enormes aportes en sus investigaciones sobre el cerebro humano. Nos ha explicado permanentemente cómo aprende el cerebro humano, cómo representa y cómo manipula los conceptos matemáticos más abstractos. Ella nos va a explicar cómo funciona esto. Ella ha observado la manera como las personas y los niños hacen las tareas matemáticas y hoy en día en esa maravilla en que estas personas de las neurociencias y estos neuropsicólogos pueden mirar a través de las resonancias magnéticas cómo piensa el pensamiento, nos puede dar una gran cantidad de luces acerca de cómo enseñar las matemáticas y cómo tener conciencia de lo que estamos modelando en el cerebro, como lo hacemos. María Madrid es alumna, compañera de investigaciones de Stanislas Dehaene, hoy en día reconocido quizás como un nuevo Piaget, una nueva postura frente al desarrollo del cerebro que está abriendo enormes caminos para que nosotros comprendamos mejor esta tarea del proceso de enseñanza. La acompañará a Marí el doctor Julio Fonnegra. El doctor Julio Fonnegra es neurocirujano y radiocirujano y es el director del Departamento de Neurociencias de la Clínica Chalo. Y ha sido un estudioso, una persona que en sus investigaciones y en todos sus procesos de posgrado ha estado siempre interesado en el proceso de cómo el cerebro, inclusive tiene una frase muy bonita que dice, para bien o para mal, somos nuestro cerebro. Y con esa afirmación nos va a acompañar en esta reunión como interlocutor de la doctora Marí Amalric. Sin más palabras y vamos a lo que vamos, le voy a ceder la palabra a la doctora Marí Amalric. Bienvenida, doctora Marí.
Thank you. Thank you for such a lovely introduction. I'm really, really pleased and happy to be here virtually today. So today, I want to tell you a little bit about my research, and this question: how does learning mathematics affect the human brain? So on the one hand, the human brain is able to solve really complex equations, to conceive irrational numbers, idealized geometrical shapes, abstract topological properties, very, very abstract concepts. And this is actually quite unique and remarkable within the animal kingdom. The human brain is quite remarkable for that. Actually, thanks to behavioral studies, we now start to understand that humans seems to have inherited some evolutionary ancient core systems. So what it means is that we think that we have some fundamental systems that are very ancient in terms of the evolution. And these systems are especially for numbers and space. So actually, many studies have now shown that the human brain is equipped from birth with a basic arithmetic system that we share with various animal species. And this system allows to exactly perceive small quantities like that, and also to evaluate approximately the number of objects in a set, and finally to perform some simple operations like an addition, for example. And our innate numerical abilities also extend to the perception of ratios and to the sense of probabilities. Actually, in this experiment that was led by Sue and Garcia, the authors showed that 8-month-old infants, so really young babies, are already able to infer some properties of the ratios of balls in this box here, in this closed box. So the experimenter is drawing a small sample of balls out of this box, red and white balls, and just based on the ratio of white versus red balls in the sample that was drawn, 8-month-old are already able to expect what is the ratio of the full population here in the box once the box is open. They would be really surprised to see something opposite, like much more white balls than red balls, for example, in this situation. And also humans, like other animal species, also have some spontaneous intuitions about spatial relations. And we also have spontaneous intuition about shapes and their properties. So in this experiment that was led in an Amazonian territory where people don't have an easy access to formal education, and they speak the Munduruku language that doesn't have specific lexicon for numbers or geometric concepts. Well, in this population, so Dehaene and collaborators presented them with slides like that, containing 6 images, among which they had to find an intruder. And well, in most cases, they reliably picked the expected intruder, which suggested that they possess geometric concepts even without words to describe them. So the human brain is well equipped to handle mathematical ideas, and we know that the human brain is totally able to conceptualize really complex and abstract concepts. But sadly, it doesn't show when we look at the sadly famous PISA results. So PISA is the Program for International Student Assessment. Those are the results for mathematics from 2018. And what it tells us is that actually many children around the world struggle to learn mathematics. And I mean, I would say, apart from struggling with this specific domain of knowledge, the problem here is that there are more and more studies showing that persistent math difficulties are correlated with higher unemployment and even some emotional maladjustment later in life. So there is really a pressing need to develop effective pedagogies here. So I'm actually going to do this, I'm sorry, so that I don't have this like flickering on top of my screen. Well, so there is this pressing need for effective pedagogy and for the development of effective pedagogy. And well, cognitive science can help with that. So here I show you two publications about the work that's conducted by Elizabeth Spelke in the lab I'm currently working. I'm not personally working on that, but this is done in the lab I'm currently in. So this work aims at designing and testing the effectiveness of various math and reading games through very large-scale field studies in India. So they are able to test those games in preschoolers all over India. So they have a lot of participant children here who can test those games, and that is very, very valuable to identify some games that would be allowing to improve kids' ability later during their school curriculum. And so this is purely behavioral work, and that's absolutely essential. And actually, some people would even argue that when it comes to education, behavioral results are the only thing that really matter. But there is also a real need for understanding the underlying brain mechanisms here, because understanding the brain mechanism can really help us understand where the potential blockages are. So here I'm going to show you an example for reading. In this study that was done by Yomcheva and collaborators, the researchers have asked adult participants to learn a series of words like that. So these words were, I would say, English words, but they were written in a completely new, unknown alphabet. And so some participants learned whole words like that, while other participants learned the correspondence between each grapheme. So in other words, the letters in this alphabet and the associated phoneme or the sound of that letter. Then the researchers submitted the participants to a knowledge test while their cerebral activity was recorded using the technique of here electroencephalography. So this is what it looks like when participants had to recognize learned words. So it's interesting because behaviorally, it seems like learning whole words is more efficient than the syllabic learning. They are a little better. Participants who learn the whole words are a little better at recognizing these words. But when you look at brain activity, actually the results from the two types of learning is completely different here. Learning whole words mostly relies on activity of the right hemisphere of the brain. And well, in most people, language regions are in the left hemisphere of the brain. So that's actually on this side that you would expect to see activity in learning how to read. And that's what you see. In participants who learned the grapheme phoneme correspondence. Now, when they were presented with new words, that they had to decipher, participants who learned to recognize letters and associated them with their sound had a clear advantage, both behaviorally and at the brain level. So this is an example where brain imaging can really help determine which learning or teaching method is going to be more effective. But for math, we only are at the beginning of understanding the neural processes, and actually most of what we know has been established in adults, and it mostly relates to I would say proto-mathematical intuitions, so those pre-mathematical intuitions that I was telling you about at the beginning of this talk. So it's basic arithmetic or geometry. We know that some regions of the parietal cortex, actually here the intraparietal sulcus, so it's I don't know if you can see me, but it's somewhere here in your brain. So this region is involved in all sorts of numerical tasks, whether they're symbolic or not, approximate or exact. And in the same parietal cortex and surrounding regions, the intraparietal sulcus and surrounding regions, there was also evidence later for a certain numerotopy. So what we call numerotopy here is this work done by Harvey and collaborators showing that the representation of numbers in the brain is spatially organized in the same order as the numbers themselves. That's what you see here. So in this little patch of cortex here, you see here where the preferred response to 1, and then the preferred response to 2, preferred response to 3, and 4, and so on and so forth. And that all happens in the parietal cortex. The parietal cortex is also known to be involved in various spatial processes, like visual spatial tasks, for example, here. And namely, the famous task of mental rotation. So when you are mentally rotating objects, you are going to activate this same region here, the intraparietal sulcus, and parietal regions around it. And there is another set of regions discovered more recently in the inferior temporal cortex. So this time it's more here, so lower in the brain. And these regions are also associated with number recognition, but not only, they're also associated with arithmetic processing. So for example, saying whether this equation is true or not. So I really wanted to present these regions because we are going to see them a lot in this talk. And so we know all these regions in adults, right? We know that they were involved in basic mathematics, but we don't really know how these math-related regions develop in children. And now in terms of learning, there are a few studies of calculation learning, such as this one that was done by Rivera and collaborators. So in this case, they followed 17 participants from age 8 to 19. They scanned them multiple times using functional MRI. So functional MRI is a technique that essentially allows to locate brain activity that's induced by a task. So during the MRI session, they asked them to judge whether a simple equation was true or false. Like, for example, this one, 3 + 2 = 6. Well, it's going to be people are going to say false. Or as a control, to say whether 0 was present in a string of digits. So from age 8, all participants were able to correctly answer the questions without any difference as they grew older, but there was a huge difference in brain activation. Here it is. So what the researchers discovered is that brain activity decreased in those frontal regions. And it decreased in a way that actually correlated with the decrease in response time that was observed throughout childhood and as they were growing older. So basically what they're thinking is that as we are automaticizing, if that's even a word, the calculation process, and it's becoming more automatic, the brain activity is decreasing in the frontal cortex, and at the same time, it's increasing in a more posterior part of the brain. And actually, what we recognize here is those parietal regions, the intraparietal sulcus, and here the inferior temporal region that I showed you earlier. So we do know some aspects of calculation learning, but we simply don't know how understanding a whole math domain like arithmetic or algebra will affect the brain. Sorry, with this quite long introduction here, in the past 2 slides, I wanted to uncover 2 big gaps in the literature that I'm trying to fill with my work. So the first question could be, how does understanding a math domain affect the brain? And second, how does the math-related brain network develop in children? So to start answering the first question, one possibility is to explore what the endpoint of the learning trajectory looks like. That's what I did actually during my PhD. I looked at a picture of the mature and expert brain that's involved in mathematical activity. And that's what I'm going to develop in the first part of my talk. Then in the second part, I'm going to focus on the evolution of brain activity during mathematics learning. And finally, I will give some very preliminary results and elements to understand what brain structures are involved in children's math learning. So, what is the cerebral representation of advanced mathematical concepts in professional mathematicians? To answer this question, we propose to professional mathematicians 3 studies that are using functional MRI, in which they had to make really fast judgments about math and controlled non-math statements. So they were listening to statements in the MRI, and they had to decide whether these statements were true or false. Actually, in the first experiment, this is how it worked. So you have to imagine they're lying in the scanner, and they have headphones, and they're listening to some sentences. They're given 4 seconds to think about the statement, and then only 2 seconds to give an answer. In this first experiment, we had 3 types of statements: true, false, and also meaningless. So I'm going to share my sound and maybe have you listen to some of them. So there were statements like that.
There is no non-vanishing continuous tangent vector field on even dimensional spheres.
So this is a true statement.
Any square matrix is equivalent to a permutation matrix.
This is a false algebraic statement. And now here I have an example of a meaningless statement.
The trace of a unit ball diverges in any dimension different from 1 and infinity.
So this is actually made out of completely valid mathematical concepts and words. The sentence itself is perfectly grammatical. But when you put all these words together, there is no real mathematical meaning for that sentence. And we also had control non-math statements. So the idea here is that we really wanted our mathematicians to think about the statement. We didn't want the statement to be something that was completely learned by heart, that was a theorem or something that they would really know right away. We wanted them to have to gather information, combine the knowledge into the sentence to really understand it and decide whether it's true or false. So we tried to do the same thing with our non-math control sentences.
In ancient Greece, a citizen who couldn't pay his debt was made a slave.
So here you have to combine some knowledge that you could have from ancient Greece and the whole citizenship system, and say that probably it's true. So on those statements, remember, they only had 4 seconds to think about it. The mathematicians performed well, but not perfectly. What we see here, so this is the level of chance here. We have 3 answers, so it's 33%. They performed well above the level of chance. And they performed similarly on our math and control statements, which means that they were well matched in terms of the difficulty. But, the statements were quite difficult still. So we were expecting to see probably activation related to this difficulty. And so to avoid this potential confound, we actually did 2 control studies after this one with another group of professional mathematicians, and here simpler statements this time and immediate response. So they didn't have time to really think about the statement anymore, but the statements that we were presenting to them were much simpler. So we also decided to test for a number of other dimension and potential confounds that could have been introduced in the first experiment. So in this one, we particularly focused on the strategy that was used to answer the problem, or the small statement. We had sentences that were likely rote learning, rote facts. We had calculation, and we had statements that were really meant to be solved by visualizing what was going on. And in the third experiment, we went to very simple statements, really short ones too. I would say almost facts. But this time, our math and control statements were perfectly matched in terms of their surface, the syntax, the grammar. The surface of the statements was completely matched. So here we have, just so that we can see what's going on. Here we have in the first experiment, very complex statements from different math domains and control statements. In experiment 2 and 3, we have much simpler statements and more immediate response, and we're manipulating here the strategy that's used to solve the problem. And here we're manipulating more of the linguistic form of it. So the grammar and the syntax, and also what's in it. So we used some quantifiers, like sum actually, and also negation, that are minimal logical operators, and also a combination of the two. In these experiments 2 and 3, participants, our professional mathematicians, answered all of these statements almost perfectly, except for trigonometry here, and we don't really know why. Probably because it's not something that that is completely known by heart throughout life. But what's really important is that the same way it was for the first experiment, all our math and control non-math statements were really well matched in terms of difficulty. Okay, so we focused the analysis in the first case only on the reflection period, because this part was really interesting because there is nothing on the screen, they're not listening to anything anymore, so there is really no input whatsoever. They're only thinking about the statements. That's what we really wanted to focus on. And experiments 2 and 3, we focus the analysis on the statement listening and their response. And so that's what I'm going to show you right now. I'm going to show you the summary of all 3 experiments. So what does that tell us? First, that there is a systematic activation for math statements. So you see in blue what correspond to more activation for the math statements than for the control statements. And you see these very, very systematic activation here in blue for the math statements versus control statements. And second, it tells us that the math concepts are encoded in distinct regions of the brain. So we have a separation between activation for math statements and the activation for the control non-math statements. And this is even the case when the syntactical surface, when the form of the sentences is perfectly matched. This is the case here. Okay, so we have our main findings here, but let's take a closer look at them. So here is a more detailed view of the set of regions that activate during mathematical reflection compared to the reflection on the control non-math statements in the first experiment. So as I was saying at the very beginning of my talk in the introduction, you're going to see a lot of these regions. Here you have the intraparietal sulcus, again, the same one. And here you see these inferior temporal regions that we were talking about. And so when we look within these regions at the temporal course of activation, so literally the signal over time, that's what we see, that's what we observed. So we have all the math domains that were tested in this first experiment. And you see that after the presentation of the math statement that is represented by this black bar here, after the presentation of the statement, the signal rose pretty sharply for all 4 math domains that we tested, and it remains sustained for a long time until the end of each trial before the next sentence was presented. And for the control non-math statement, well, we observed no activation or even a deactivation. But so what's important is that these regions are activated here regardless of the math domains. So now we've seen that all math domains activated this region pretty similarly. Let's see whether the solving strategy has an effect. So in experiment 2, remember, we had math statements that were more like rote facts, and we had calculation, and we also had statements that had to be answered with visual imagery. And so we could expect that some categories of statement, like the one known by heart typically, or maybe even the ones that we need to use visual imagery to answer, we could expect that these would somehow short circuit the responsive network. So I'm going to show you here is another type of visualization of the brain, but I really like this one, even if it's a little more abstract to understand what's going on. But I really like it because this is literally where you've been kind of inflating the brain and then cutting it at different spots so that you make it like a flat map. So it is like a planisphere of the brain that really allows you to see the entire brain at one glance. So I think for what we want to do here, it's a really, really good representation. So you have here all the type of statements, all the categories of statements that were tested in experiment 2. And we're really going to pay attention to what's in red, because this is what shows the math activation more than the control statement activation. And so what you see is, so this is the left hemisphere, and you see that, well, these red clusters, these red blobs here are really, 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 really similarly located. And same thing in the right hemisphere. So at one glance here, we can really observe and see that well, the math responsive network activates independently of the solving strategy that was used. Just to confirm that, because I really like this representation, I think it's really striking, and I'm going to explain it. So here you see kind of an index of activation in the main math region. So of the 4 of them, we're looking at an average of this index of activation in these regions. And we're looking at it for each sentence, each statement that was presented during the experiments. So they're all here with different colors. And you see the control statements that are all here below 0. So no activation or even the deactivation here in these math regions. And you see all the math statements here in no particular order. The colors that correspond to the categories are all mixed together. So that's just another way to say that the solving strategy, the domain here, doesn't really matter. They all activate the math responsive network. Okay, so now let's take a closer look at the relation between math-related regions of the brain and the language regions. So here in green, you see the contrast of the meaningful control non-math statements versus meaningful math statements from the first experiment. And actually, these regions are typically involved in semantic processing, in computing the meaning of a sentence. Quite remarkably here, these 4 regions exhibit a completely opposite pattern as the one that we saw in the math regions. So when you look at the temporal course of activation in these regions now, you see an activation for the control statements, but no activation or deactivation for the math statements. So we really have a separation, it seems like, in the way that mathematical concepts are encoded, decoded, combined in the brain, represented. And so as a confirmation that math and language brain regions are dissociated, I show you here the superposition of the brain map that you've now seen quite a bit, that's in yellow, with the map that shows activation to just simply listening to spoken statements. So the red activation here really is the typical language regions in the brain, and you see how this red activation and yellow activation are completely separated. But on the contrary, at the end of the first experiment, well, mathematicians were also doing 2 additional tasks. that are typically called localizers because they allow to locate rapidly brain activity that's related to general cognitive functions. And so in this case, they had to watch some, to just passively look at pictures and also to do some quick subtractions and listen to sentences. So this allowed us to compare in the same participants or mathematicians, the brain regions that are involved in high-level reflection and in basic arithmetic processing. So this is the method that you've been seeing this whole time, the math versus control non-math reflection, the first experiment. This is what happens when they're looking at numbers versus all sorts of other pictures. And this is what happens when they're doing very simple calculation versus compared to just listening to sentences. And this is the intersection. It's quite remarkable that we see the intraparietal sulcus that we have already seen in our introduction and the inferotemporal regions. So now these regions are also very notoriously involved in visuospatial processing. So that led us to wonder whether high-level math processing would rely on visual processes. It's actually an hypothesis that really transpires in the math community. Mathematicians will often talk about their work by using vision-related words. So to test this hypothesis, we scanned 3 blind mathematicians on experiments 1 and 2. And well, this is the summary of what you've seen already, our professional mathematicians in experiment 1 and 2. And this is the results in our 3 blind mathematicians. And actually what you see is that they recruit the same math network. So even at the level, even at the individual level, we have activation here in the intraparietal sulcus and in the inferotemporal regions. Okay, so there is a core network, a very fundamental network that's composed of bilateral intraparietal sulcus and bilateral inferotemporal region for math in the brain that is recycling evolutionarily ancient systems for numerosity in space, and that's activated regardless of the math domain or problem difficulty, and also activated independently of visual experience. And finally, that's dissociated from the language network. So now that we know what brain activity to expect after deeply understanding various math domains, we can use that knowledge to evaluate a very popular form of learning, especially nowadays during the pandemic, which is the Khan Academy style, where you watch a short video and you practice what you just learned in short tasks. So 20 math students from the Parisian from some Parisian universities participated in this experiment. They actually had to watch some video lessons while being scanned by an fMRI scanner. So they were watching math and control video lessons. And they were tested before and after by using the same method that we use with mathematicians. So they're listening to a statement. They have to think about it and answer whether the statement is true or false. And we had some known statements, some statements that were unknown at the beginning, but would become hopefully known after they were taught in the videos, and also unknown statements that would remain unknown because they were not taught. So I wanted to show you briefly what it looks like, but unfortunately it's in French. So
Voici une autre manière de modéliser une séquence d'observation. Supposons que vous ayez un ami qui voyage dans 3 villes, Londres, Rome, Paris. Chaque midi, il a la possibilité de manger 4 types de plats. Des sushis, une pizza, un sandwich ou une salade avec une certaine probabilité en fonction de la ville dans laquelle il se trouve.
Yeah, here we don't need to go all the way through, but this is a video that created to explain what a hidden Markov model is. And so it's a very concrete way to represent what it is. So we have this character that is sending a picture of what he's been eating for lunch every day. And And we know the transitional probabilities between different cities and the probability of eating which food in which city, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one of the math video that we created. And we also had a control non-math video. Here it's the some concept linked to the property law.
Voici une autre.
Here we go. And so here is actually what you see when you compare what's going on when they're thinking about known concept in math versus the control concepts. And what we have is basically a replication of our previous findings, but here for non-experts. So we have again this intraparietal sulcus here and inferior temporal regions that are more activated when you're thinking about math statements. And to just go a little further, we could also compare what's happening in the brain when you process something that's known for something that you don't know in math. And well, we basically see the same network of region again. So that just let us realize, oh, that's just a confirmation of what's going on in the brain in terms of the temporal course again. So we have only activation for the math statements that are known and no activation for the other statements. So that's just that just goes to show that it's really about the meaning of the word. It's not because you know that it's about math that it's going to be enough to activate this math responsive network. You really have to understand and to have somehow encoded the meaning of the concept. And when we wanted to look at what was going on during the video lesson now, we have to actually come up with a slightly different technique of analysis for the signal, because a video is such a complex input that we can't really use traditional analysis technique. And so what we're using is what's called the intersubject correlations. So to do that, you're going to basically look at correlation of activation between pairs of subjects. So you take subject one and you go look in each voxel of the subject one's brain. So a voxel is literally a unit of volume that's equivalent to a pixel, but in volume, so we call it voxel. So you're going to look at the activation over time that's happening in each voxel of subject one brain. And in the same voxel of subject two, you're going to do the same thing. Look at the temporal evolution of activation, and you see how they're correlated, whether or not they're correlated. And when you do that for the math and the control non-math videos in our case, that's what you get. So we see that when people are just passively watching math content, their brain activity is more synchronized among people in the intraparietal sulcus and also in this inferior temporal region again. But one thing that we discovered here is that now when you look at what's going on as an effect of learning, as a result of learning, well, you see that we induced behaviorally some learning. So they got better at answering the math and control statements that they were just taught. But when you look at activation in the brain now, what happens is an activation in regions that have nothing to do with the math responsive network. It's completely outside of it. So it seems like the math and language related brain circuits are also separated in non-experts, both during active reflection and during passive exposure to a lesson. And that short videos actually did not suffice to induce changes in the brain's math network. So I see that my time is almost up, but maybe if I can take 5 minutes to show you the last part. I think I just need that. So I would just want to show you some very preliminary results about what happens when children now are exposed to a school-like math learning. So why school-like? Because in this case, we had a group of third grade children that were invited while being scanned with fMRI again to watch a pedagogical arithmetic video that taught them about the commutative principle of multiplication. Actually, I'm going to show you the first video. I think it's quite cute. Oh,
hello.
No,
Today,
here.
hello. Today we're going to understand what the commutative principle of multiplication is. Let's see an example. Look, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 frogs. Oh, they go in 2 different ponds. In each pond, there are 1, 2, and 3 frogs. So the 6 frogs have separated into 2 groups of 3 frogs. This means that there are 2 times 3 frogs, and it is written 2 times 3. Now look, the same 6 frogs move in 3 different ponds, and in each pond there are 1 and 2 frogs. So the 6 frogs have separated into 3 groups of 2 frogs. This means that there are 3 times 2 frogs, and it is written 3 times 2. In this example, we have seen that 2 times 3 frogs equals 3 times 2 frogs equals 6 frogs.
And so that was the first sequence, but then we had, a progression in the lessons. So in the second video sequence, they were still lying in the scanner and watching that, right? We were showing them a second example, and then we were using the commutative principle in in application, a third example. As a control, they were also watching a grammar video that was about relative pronouns. So I'm not gonna play the videos, but you can see that it's the same character and the same background and the same idea. We have a little teacher that's explaining what's the purpose of relative pronouns. And at the end, they were also exposed to a small test that looked like that. That was a test of conductivity in particular. And they had, while the circles were red, they had to say whether the number of dots in both circles were the same or not. And we compared that also with symbolic calculation. But so what we're particularly interested in was to assess children's neural maturity during these 3 tasks. So the neural maturity is actually a kind of intersubject correlation. So what we just saw before, a kind of intersubject correlation, but this time that is calculating between each children and the average neural activity of a group of adults. So it really tells you how adult-like is the activation in a children's brain. So the idea of neural maturity. So this is what it looks like when we look at neural maturity for each of the 3 tasks that were used in this experiment. And so what you see here is basically the visual stimulation. So all 3 tasks were visually presented. So they activated altogether the visual cortex. We also see the effect of simulation in the auditory cortex because our 2 videos, arithmetic and grammar, also have language and sentences. And here, what you see is the effect of the math content. And so that is just showing that children are showing adult-like activity that is related to the math content of what they're doing in the intraparietal sulcus again, and here also a little bit in the right intertemporal region. So it seems like the math-related network is kind of already in place here. But now if you look at the difference between the intersubject relation among adults versus among children, that kind of gives you an idea of what are the regions that are still in development, where we have more synchronized activation in adult than we have in children. And these regions actually are here. So a little part of the anterior intraparietal sulcus in the right hemisphere, and the left inferior temporal cortex here. At least in this experiment, that's what we found. So it seems like most math-related brain responses are already in place by age 9, even though the full network is still in development. And it's especially the case in the right anterior IPS and the left inferior temporal cortex. So this is simply the global summary of what I've presented you today. I can very quickly finish with some perspectives on later work that could be done. So we've seen that we have the separation of the math and language brain networks here that really seems to exist once the concept's meaning has been encoded and mastered. But we still don't really know what happens over the course of learning. It could really be that language is a primary means by which we learn, right? So it also might depend on the math domain. And it's also likely that learning relies on various fundamental bricks, right? Like language, visual, spatial skills, some habit of mind, or other bricks. And the other maybe perspective for some future work is that we really have to go deeper in the exploration of the development of math responsive regions in the brain. We really have no idea what are the core functions of these regions that were exhibited, and especially the case for the inferior temporal regions. So it seems like maybe to assess that, we'll have to do a study throughout life where we're actually scanning children as they grow, and see how these regions are developing and how they relate to their performance in school or on some standardized test. So with that, I actually want to thank all the collaborators who participated in those studies. Stanislas Dehaene, who was my PhD advisor, and an old picture of the Unicode lab where the mathematicians project was completed. And also Jessica Cantlin, with whom I did my first postdoc, and the Chaos Lab, where I performed the children study. And also all of you for your attention.
Well, Anne-Marie, doctora Marie, muchísimas gracias. Es realmente pues muy interesante todo lo que usted nos deja pensando después de esta charla. Nos muestra una dimensión completamente diferente de la enseñanza de la matemática y del potencial que tenemos para aprender mucho más en cómo abordar la enseñanza de la matemática. Le voy a pedir al doctor Connegra, a Julio, que nos haga un comentario, sus impresiones, y nos ayude a dilucidar un poco el tema desde pues, de la neurociencia y desde su especialidad y tantos pequeños pacientes que vienen de la parte de la dislexia, la discalculia, etc. Julio, bienvenido.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Mira que extraordinaria la charla que nos ha dado la doctora Amalric. Yo leí sus primeros escritos en Neuroimage en el año 2019 con el doctor Dehaene, y ahí aprendí porque yo creía como Chomsky que el lenguaje había brotado espontáneamente reciclando áreas del cerebro para otras cosas antiguas. Y el lenguaje y las matemáticas eran lo mismo. Entonces me causó una extraordinaria emoción encontrar que tenemos otras vías neuronales, otros sitios para procesar el lenguaje. Y eso me hace hacer una reflexión.
Julio,
¿Cuál será?
perdóname, Julio, ¿podrías prender tu cámara?
Sí.
Gracias.
¿Listo?
Listo.
Eso me hizo hacer una grandísima reflexión, y es que el cerebro no permite que nada evolucione que no sirva. Lo que no sirve se desecha, y lo que preserva la especie se conserva. Entonces eso me ha hecho pensar que cómo será de importante las matemáticas para el cerebro para que haya hecho un subuniverso de las mismas. Y pues eso me ha llamado de emoción neurocientífica. Aparte de eso, el problema de los niños o los adultos discalcúlicos es alteración en el cálculo para las personas que nos escuchen. Dislexia es para la lectura. Sabemos mucho de dislexia. Hay terapeutas para dislexia. Conocemos bastante bien las áreas del lenguaje, pero del problema del cálculo puro, porque hay personas que son completamente normales en todos los aspectos, salvo en el cálculo. Esas personas pueden ser un 9 o un 10% de todos. Entonces, no hay expertos para que enseñen el lenguaje matemático a las personas normales, o hay pocos. Y menos aún para las personas que tienen disfunción cerebral en este sentido. En esto hay que hacer pues un gran esfuerzo. Y el esfuerzo que ustedes, los neurocientíficos, están haciendo para esto en el futuro nos va a dar muchas bases para poder mejorar a nuestros pacientes, a nuestros enfermos, las personas afectadas con este problema. Gracias.
Por ese comentario. Hay varias preguntas en el chat. Voy a resumir para la doctora María. Dos. La primera es, hay una pregunta muy fuerte sobre, pues, de qué manera estos descubrimientos que usted ha hecho, aunque me parece que en la última parte usted lo dijo, tal vez repetirlo, podrían, digamos, o deberían afectar de una manera directa pedagogías más efectivas de la matemática. Esa sería una pregunta.
Yes. So I think that we're not completely there yet, but the fact that we know where to expect math-related activation in the brain is really important, because that means that we can really test the effectiveness of a method, of a certain type of pedagogy, to actually enhance the activation of the same math-related network. So I think it's more this way that we have to look at it. It's not really, so far, I don't think that we really have enough information to really be able preemptively to design a pedagogy that will for sure work. But what we can do is test different types of pedagogies and see how they affect the brain, and see which one is more likely to have longer lasting effects, if that makes sense. Yes.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Julio, en un reciente escrito que tuviste oportunidad de compartir con nosotros, pues escribiste textualmente: conocer cómo actuar o modificar positivamente, es decir, hacer la intervención apropiada, tanto de forma primaria en el cerebro en desarrollo como en la información externa, nos ayudará a encontrar la solución a los problemas de discalculio. ¿Cómo es tu investigación ahí? El micrófono, Julio.
No es mi investigación. Lo que pasa es que a mí me toca operar por allá cosas y tumores en esos sitios que menciona la doctora Marie. Entonces, para mí, tengo ciertas dificultades y a veces tengo que operar las personas despiertas con cálculos, con diferentes cálculos para saber que yo no dañe esas estructuras interparietales. Lo que estoy diciendo, y la doctora Marie también, ella ha estudiado los genes que intervienen en ese acumulador primario con el cual nacemos. Entonces, si nosotros podemos encontrar cuáles son los principales genes que intervienen en las matemáticas, eso es un tratamiento interno. O sea, podríamos modificar genéticamente el resultado de alguna manera en un futuro no muy lejano. Y lo externo es que tenemos que manejar los ambientes culturales, ambientales que influyen en el cerebro. El cerebro es simplemente un receptor de información. No hay nada más. Lo único que hace el cerebro es computar la información externa con la información interna que viene de las vísceras, de los tendones, de los músculos, etc. Y de acuerdo a ese resultado va para un lado o para otro y responde. Ese es el cerebro. Entonces, cuando hablamos del cerebro, tenemos que manejarlo internamente, lo que podamos, y el ambiente. Tenemos que buscar qué es lo mejor en esos dos sentidos para mejorarlos. Por ejemplo, uno puede hacer estimulación electromagnética externa del cerebro y uno puede mejorar la cognición. Si uno estimula, por ejemplo, ciertas partes del cerebro, uno puede mejorar la atención, la concentración, los resultados cognitivos. Y eso es una cosa que se hace en unos minutos, un tiempo. Por ejemplo, eso es una manera de tratar estas cosas que todavía está pues para investigar, para saber.
Doctora María, ¿usted quiere comentar algo sobre lo que acaba de decir el doctor Fonnegra? O si no, tengo otro montón de preguntas para usted.
Yeah, I think I'd like to just make a little comment on that. So it's really interesting that we know all of that about the brain, but there is something that we don't know, is whether natural enhanced activation or shape or anatomy or of these regions that are part of this math responsive network, whether any difference in that has any sort of behavioral correlate whatsoever. So there are very few, but still, I think I know 6 studies who try to test, for example, math giftedness and see whether a better performance at math had some sort of correlate in the brain. They found, in general, an enhanced activation in those regions that I was mentioning, especially the parietal cortex. But what is really interesting is that we don't know whether it's because they really trained a lot at math that we see this enhanced activation, or maybe a difference in the functional connectivity in these regions. And I think that's personally my favorite interpretation of that. My personal opinion is that it's because they have been actually doing a lot of math that we are observing these effects on the brain. But it could also be that their brain was like that from the beginning, and that would be the explanation for their better performance later in life. I doubt that it's the case, and the reason I doubt that it's the case is because there are a few studies that try to link some genetic variants to activations in the brain and also to performance. And what tends to be true is that, okay, we can explain the variance, the interindividual variance in the activation of these regions by some genetic factors, yes. But what is interesting is that those same genetic factors are not also explaining the interindividual variance in math achievement, in math performance. So it doesn't seem like it's not that easy that that there is a strict correlation between the difference in activation and immediate and this interpretation in terms of performance. So it's not clear that any sort of intervention on the brain structures themselves, that would be a human intervention on the structures themselves, would actually result in something particular, either enhancing or like degrading the math ability, unless you're taking the entire region out of surgery, and that would probably create a lot of dyscalculia, for example. But yeah, so just to be clear that it's not that simple. There is not a direct correspondence, at least in terms of performance in activity. There is a correspondence between I would say the cognitive function and activation in the brain, but the level of performance and activation is not that easily correlated.
Muy interesante porque muchas de las preguntas que tenemos en el chat están buscando o preguntando como por una mayor diferenciación, si hay una real diferenciación en la manera como se aprende el lenguaje, en cómo aparece en el cerebro, en las conexiones que se hacen y la manera como se aprende, y un poco si la matemática es como la encargada de hacer la mayor cantidad como de interconexiones. Ese es como un tipo de preguntas. Y el otro tipo de preguntas, que con esa podríamos terminar para que el doctor Fonegra pudiera participar en esa conversación, es un poco la pregunta sobre si ese potencial o esa capacidad matemática que parece venir un poco genéticamente como con cada cerebro, se puede de alguna manera estimular o estudiar en el bebé para prevenir posibles problemas futuros. Entonces serían esas dos preguntas, la de la diferencia entre lenguaje y matemática en el cerebro, y después un poco la de los bebés y ese como armazón con que nacen los niños y cómo se puede intervenir. ¿Listo? Para que ustedes terminen en una conversación un par de minutos. Gracias, doctor.
Do you want me to start? Okay. Okay. So my take on that is that, okay, we do see the separation between the language network and the math network. But once again, I really want to insist on the fact that we observe that once the concepts are learned and mastered, I also want to remind you of the calculation learning experiment that I showed you at the very beginning of my talk, where we really saw this switch of activation, this transfer of activation from frontal region to the parietal region. So it really seems that it's not immediate that we have activations in this math responsive network. It's really the result of training, of learning, and so it's not because afterwards the meaning of the concepts are encoded in separate regions of the brain that language is not involved at all in learning. I think it's quite the opposite. To be frank, I think that language is probably one of the most valuable and important tool that we have to teach that, right? So I mean, you go to school and all of the math concepts are taught through sentences, through language, they're words, and you can describe them and even maybe describe them in concrete ways, in words, in the language, in your mother tongue. So I think that this question of the separation between the two actually only comes later, and that math learning is so multifaceted that we cannot take language completely out of it. Now that that doesn't mean that language is the only thing. I was just saying it's one of our most valuable tools to teach it. But I think that what the separation afterwards tells us is that the very deep and profound roots of mathematical comprehension comes from something that is maybe even that was there maybe even before language. I think that those regions that we see, I mean, we see them also in a lot of animal species, and they're doing the same thing. So these are definitely evolutionarily ancient. They were here before language. So to me, it's just saying that those math concepts, they are relying on intuitions, even maybe more fundamental intuitions than what we develop growing up through language. So to enhance these intuitions and maybe hope that we will provide all the tools for young children to be really equipped to handle math learning later in life. Yeah, I think we can do a lot between the age of 0 and 5, you know. I am not the one right now creating specific pedagogies, and I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I for sure I think that we can probably do a lot during these years at enhancing any sorts of intuitions, concrete intuitions that are going to be the roots of later math development and more abstract concepts.
Okay, thank you. Julio, un minuto para comentar.
Bueno, pues muy interesante. Yo creo que en el cerebro no puede uno, o sea, todo está relacionado. No tenemos órganos diferentes, la vista, el tacto, el sentido, el oído, la matemática, el lenguaje, todo está unido. Tenemos 80.000 millones de células en el cerebro y cada una tiene 10.000 conexiones. Yo hago acupuntura, por ejemplo, y si pongo una aguja en algún punto, estoy modificando toda la actividad cerebral. Eso es lo que llamamos neuromodulación. Y es que el cerebro no es muy eficiente energéticamente tampoco. O sea, un cerebro eficiente sería que 4 o 5 o 10 células cojan toda la información y la tengan ahí lista. El cerebro tiene la información dispersa por todas partes y encontrarla es difícil. Por eso la memoria nos falla tanto. Mientras empieza el cerebro a buscar sus datos de memoria en los diferentes sitios, se pierde, se olvidan las cosas y el cerebro las inventa. Por eso nuestra memoria, repito, es frágil. Y así es todo. O sea, uno tiene que manejar el cerebro de forma holística. Holística es que no hay cerebro sin corazón y sin riñones. Y el cerebro es uno solo, absolutamente conectado, y eso es lo que nos complica la vida. Una misma hormona o una misma sustancia química en el cerebro, hablemos de la oxitocina, por ejemplo, que sirve para producir la leche materna, pero es nuestra hormona del amor filial. Entonces, cosas tan dispares que complican. Y hablemos así, una misma sustancia hace cosas muy diferentes, depende de la región y el circuito en el cerebro que usen. Y ese es el reciclaje del cerebro. O sea, el cerebro se va construyendo a sí mismo y eso es como hacer un Mercedes-Benz con el chasis de un Renault 4. O sea, eso no va a quedar muy bien al final. Sirve, pero no va a quedar muy bien. Y entonces esa es la dificultad del cerebro. Sus grandes conexiones y sus grandes alivios de energía que tiene que obtener una cosa para hacer muchas.
Gracias, Julio. Bueno, yo creo que podríamos quedarnos aquí embelesados oyendo a la doctora Marie y a Julio y su conversación, pero como todo lo bueno tiene que tener un final. Muchísimas gracias, doctora Marie, realmente su exposición, su sonrisa permanente, su esfuerzo en en hacernos entender temas tan difíciles, pues es muy apreciado. Muchísimas gracias para el Colegio Hacienda Los Alcaparros. Realmente es un honor haberla tenido acá. Como siempre, Julio, muchísimas gracias porque has sido pues un acompañante de este proceso del Colegio Hacienda Los Alcaparros en entender muy, muy profundamente el tema de las neurociencias y el papel que ocupan en las pedagogías. Creo que quedamos en deuda con todas las personas que nos están oyendo. Han surgido más preguntas acerca del cerebro y lo motriz, la matemática y el movimiento. Hay un montón de preguntas que seguramente tendremos que organizar una segunda charla. Muchísimas gracias. A todos los asistentes, pues muchas gracias. Para nosotros es realmente un motivo de celebración lograr esta serie de Cerebro Matemático. Nos queda la 4ª en junio. Les invitamos a toda la semana matemática que tiene maravillosos programas para los padres, para los niños, organizada por la Asociación Nacional de Matemáticas. Y bueno, pues llegamos al final. Muchísimas gracias por su presencia.